Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome to Point of View on this Wednesday, August 22nd, 2018 day. I'm your host, Nick Pitts, for the Millennial Roundtable, and so excited to be with you all today. We've got Kerby Anderson with us in studio. Kerby, how are you this morning?
I'm always doing well and glad to have you sitting in that chair over there.
So glad to be here with you. And quite a news day, one can say.
Oh, yes.
There's quite a show that we're going to have much to be able to unpack with you all. At 4 o'clock Eastern Time, hour yesterday was quite...
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah, I think it broke the internet.
Yes, that's right.
There's always pictures that are trying to break the internet, but I think the news broke the internet yesterday.
I think so.
So we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the things that happened yesterday, everything from Representative Duncan Hunter getting indicted due to campaign finance expenditures that he and his wife racked up and not properly accounting for some of those, as well as what was happening relative to Paul Manafort and being the jury finding him guilty for 8 counts, and then Michael Cohen, who we know is the president's personal lawyer, was pleaded guilty to 8 counts, and then all the more. But we'll also be talking about some other things as well. We've got a couple of authors that will be joining us later on during the show. We've got Brent McDougal, who wrote a new book called Faith, Hope, and Politics, that will be interviewing and talking to him a little bit more, especially from the millennial perspective, because this book is kind of geared towards millennial perspective, and so it'll be really interesting. I just was very fascinated reading the book, and so I'll be anxious to be able to go back and forth with him, as well as in the last hour, we'll have Jonathan Merritt joining us today. Jonathan Merritt is the author of the new book, Learning to Speak God from Scratch. For listeners, you'll probably remember we had Jonathan on a couple of months ago when he was here for the Southern Baptist Convention in June, I believe. And so since then, his book's come out. I've read the book, and I have a multitude of questions to ask him about the book, and can't wait for him to join us as well. And as always, we'll be opening up the phone lines. And so you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number's 800-351-1212. For those of you in Facebook land, hello. Thank you so much for tuning in to us in Facebook land. You can leave a question or comment right underneath the live video box, and what you share online, we'll try to share over air as well. But nevertheless, let's jump into it, Kerby.
Okay. Which one first?
Well, let's go with the one, I guess, that technically happened first. I think was it Paul Manafort.
All right.
So
Manafort.
If we remember the former campaign chairman of President Trump's successful 2016 presidential election, Paul Manafort was found guilty on 8 counts of fraud. According to the Washington Post, Manafort was convicted on 5 counts of filing false tax returns, 1 count of not filing a required IRS form, and 2 bank fraud accounts. And kind of Axios does a really good job of indicating why it matters is because Manafort's guilty verdict may strengthen potentially Mueller's hand as he continues to investigate possible conspiracy and seeks an interview with the president. But nevertheless, what we continue to find is that the president, even though he didn't know Manafort very well, I think that was very well documented. And then the president, even yesterday, went out and said that, again, what we continued to see was that there's no collusion with Russia, which he's correct on.
Yes.
This is pretty stinging, I guess you would say, to have the individual that led your campaign for a time now go down and be found guilty on 8 counts, which is it's just a very, what a time to be alive, Kerby. What a time to be alive.
Well, it does give us something to talk about. And first of all, let's state the obvious, and that is if Hillary Clinton had won the election, and of course this is a big what if Hillary Clinton won the election, would there have ever been an investigation of Paul Manafort. Maybe, maybe not. Certainly, there wouldn't have been a collusion investigation because it probably would have said no harm, no foul. But nevertheless, that's the situation we find ourselves in right now. Or more importantly, he finds himself in. And if you think he only got charged for, of course, 8 out of 18 was enough.
Yeah.
I mean, he could spend 70 years, and he's 69 years of age. You can do the math, figure out, spend the rest of his life in jail. But that's not all, because after all, there's still a trial next month on money laundering, and there's still a possibility, not that Robert Mueller would want to do so, but there's a possibility that they could go back on those 10 acquittal, because they're not acquittals, they're just basically hung juries, and go back for the other 10. And so this could be to the point where it was just overkill. So he's facing a tremendous amount of pressure, most of which, again, let's be fair, in a way that the press hasn't been very fair. Yeah. This is looking back on some things that happened in 2005, 2006. So that was 10 years ago for somebody who spent about 6 months on the Trump campaign. Is that a negative? Yes. Again, when Robert Mueller writes his final report, whenever that might be, maybe at the close of the millennium, I don't know. But nevertheless, when he does, at the very least, he has to write that Donald Trump may have not been engaged in collusion, but he certainly did not exercise good judgment by bringing a person like Paul Manafort, who had all of this baggage and these connections to Ukraine, into the campaign. Is that fair?
And a large part of it is, too, and just to continue to trumpet this side, is the idea that this was known. Like his dealings with the Ukraine, his dealings, this was not
Why did you bring him in the first place?
So there's that question of why did you bring him in, especially when you only hire the best people, as what
supposedly,
he said. So I think that's a hit. But it is kind of telling because, again, personally, I think many Americans are just exhausted with the Mueller investigation right now. They want the truth. They want to get to the bottom of the truth. Yeah. But in an instant gratification, Netflix microwave era, they want the truth immediately. They want the satisfied end. And so it does raise the question, Kirby, I think would be really interesting to ask is, when is this thing going to end?
That's the big question, yes.
Because you have Rudy Giuliani, who's the president's lawyer right now, has said that this thing is going to end in September. But at the end of the day, Mueller continues to throw out these indictments, continues to be able to offer up all of these comments. And what he's doing is he's pretty much hitting 1,000 right now. Everything that he's put out there. I mean, he's showing his work, as my 7th grade math teacher would show me. And he hasn't gotten to the final product yet. But what he has done is he's connected on a lot of different areas, and he continues to show that he's doing significant work. Now, is any of it relative to Russian collusion? Some of it is, obviously, but it's just very interesting right now where we find ourselves with, especially with the Mueller investigation.
One other thing I'll put on, just because we're going to a break, is to recognize that one of the partners of Paul Manafort is a man by the name of Rick Gates. And some people that were court watchers, and I'm not one of them, so I'll just trust them, that were saying, the various indictments that did not bring a conviction in most cases had to do with the jury may be looking at Rick Gates and saying, you got a plea deal here and you were his, so I'm not sure how much I trust you either. So it's the convictions on the 8 that had less to do with the testimony of Rick Gates, which I thought was kind of interesting and something to think about as well. In case any of our listeners serve on a jury, the question you need to ask yourself is, if this individual took a plea deal and so they're going to not go to jail or they're not going to be charged, how honest are they in terms of their testimony? And apparently the jury said, anything that Rick Gates says, maybe we believe it, maybe we don't, but we're going to be a hung jury on that particular issue.
I think that's, again, one of the things that we can take away from is, one, I think you might be exhausted by the Mueller investigation. I think what many Americans are, but what we continue to see is that there is substance that's coming from it. Yep. And at the end of the day, what we want is a system by which justice can be enacted and just punishment can be upheld or kind of leveled out. And so that's what we continue to see. But we're going to have to take a break. But when we come back from the break, unfortunately, there's a lot more news that came out of the courthouse yesterday.
Michael Cohen, you want to do that one next?
Yeah, which might be which probably could have been the one that we led with. But nevertheless, we're going to have to take a break. But when we come back from the break, we'll talk a little bit more about Michael Cohen. We'll talk a little bit more about Duncan Hunter. We'll talk a little bit more. I mean, there's just so many aspects that we can continue to talk about. But we've got to take a break. You can call in 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. And when we come back, more from the Cohen investigation. Mm-hmm.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recently, Jay Cost wrote that the Declaration of Independence was more radical than any of the men who signed it. Once you understand that important point, you can give more credit to the document than it currently receives on most college campuses. The standard line is this. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, but he was a slave owner. There's a significant disconnect between his words and his deeds. Jay Cost, author of the new book, The Price of Greatness, argues that the Declaration set in motion the means to remove all governmental privilege. Over time, the Declaration was used to eliminate property restrictions for voting, then abolition, women's suffrage, and voting rights of African Americans. The justification for each of these revolutions was grounded in the philosophy of the Declaration. Now, to be fair to Thomas Jefferson, he actually wrote in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence that the king waged cruel war against human nature itself, against a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. These words were rejected by representatives from the southern colonies. Jefferson also expressed his opinion that slavery was a hideous blot and that it constituted moral depravity. He also led an effort in the Virginia legislature to ban the slave trade. Later, he proposed a program of slave emancipation and even urged federal legislation that would have banned slavery in the territories. None of that is to defend Jefferson, but at least to provide some context that is often missing in both academic and popular discussions of Jefferson and the Declaration. The document may not have banned slavery, but it did provide the foundation for the changes we enjoy today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined by Kerby Anderson here at the Millennial Roundtable, and we have been talking about the I guess you would call it all the president's guilty men. I guess
that's what you called it on the daily briefing. I thought that was a good line there. Yeah.
Axios put it out. And so, Kerby, during the break, again, this was one of those conversations that I wish the microphones probably could have been on. But nevertheless, over the break, we were talking about just like what's the significance of a lot of this, right? So especially the Paul Manafort, more than Michael Cohen, definitely Paul Manafort. There's probably people sitting around the table right now that are listening, if they haven't already clicked off, and they're trying to figure out what does this have to do with me? Is there any relevance to what this is that's going to affect me?
Not a lot in terms of the day to day. I said to you off air, but I'll say the same thing. One of the stories that the mainstream media is not covering is a 20-year-old that was killed by an illegal alien. Now, that might have more impact because almost all of us are around illegal immigrants from time to time, and most of them are honest, God-fearing kind of people, hardworking, but every once in a while there's an MS-13 or something like that. So that would have more impact than this was. People right now go, Paul Manafort, why should I care? Well, again, it will affect not only Donald Trump's standing, although I don't think it's going to affect his poll numbers very much, but it will affect the midterm elections. And even a few days ago, I went through in all sorts of detail some of those individuals who have been mostly accurate. They were almost all inaccurate 2 years ago, but mostly accurate, I say, who now are predicting that the House of Representatives might have a much greater chance, maybe a 3-to-1 chance, 3/4 to 1/4, that the Democrats will get the requisite number of 23. Some are estimating maybe 36 Democrats that will take positions that used to be held by Republicans, and though the Democrats will actually control the House of Representatives. Did this arrest, indictment, and now conviction of Paul Manafort have any impact? A little bit, and only a little bit can go a long way.
Yep.
So I think in that respect it does. The other one, which we'll talk about in just a minute, is Michael Cohen, because did that violate campaign finance laws? I don't think that it did, and I say that not because I'm an expert on it, but the former head of the Federal Elections Commission said this is not an in-kind payment. We can go into the details there. But again, all of that controversy for the low information voter who's just sort of barely paying attention right now says, well, I don't know, that Trump administration looks pretty corrupt. Maybe it's time to put a Democrat in the House of Representatives. So that's the long-term impact, long-term in the terms of a few months.
Yeah.
But it's certainly the impact that some of this might have on your life, because a very different Democratic Congress in January is not the same as the Republican Congress we have right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking about it, and even from a spiritual perspective, right? Let's just look at it from a spiritual truth, and so we'll devotionalize. Is kind of the way that I'll say it. If we devotionalize it, we'll just it's just an ever-present reminder for us just to be keenly aware of who we associate with. At the end of the day, we know that there are individuals of bad company that can corrupt good morals, is what the biblical narrative would say. And I'm not trying to argue that Paul Manafort corrupted, but I would say that the association is enough to be able to corrupt him.
I think it was well known, you know. I think Donald Trump and his campaign knew what they were getting.
Yep.
And what they were getting was somebody that didn't help them at all.
Yeah.
And if he had never joined the campaign, would we even know the name Paul Manafort?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
No, I don't either. I don't either. But let's keep on going. Let's go down the list one more time, and which might be a little bit more meaty, which is the Michael Cohen. Who is the private lawyer of President Trump. And even in a shocking little twist, President Trump tweeted earlier this morning something.
You don't want to have him as your lawyer. Did you see that?
If you're looking for a good lawyer, do not look at Michael Cohen or whatever.
Which I can never imagine the kind of things that go through his mind, because if that's what he types, I can't even imagine what he was thinking before he typed that.
You know, I thought it was just funny, pure. It's like it really was comedic, and it's again one of those. We shouldn't
be laughing about it, but it was just hilarious. It's
just so I'll quote him. If anyone is looking for a good lawyer, I would strongly suggest that you don't retain the services of Michael Cohen. I mean, that's funny. I mean, at the end of the day,
how could you not love that? It's just unbelievable.
That's funny, but Michael Cohen's actions, I guess, here we go. So we'll get into it a little bit more. So Michael Cohen's actions were not funny, and so yesterday Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to 8 criminal counts, which is just
8 felonies.
8 felonies.
Let's get out on the table, because that's something I want to talk about in a minute.
Yeah, and kind of the one that individuals are kind of moving towards is that he implicated, I guess, to a certain degree, President Trump, saying that he was the one that directed him, I guess is the wording that was used, directed him to pay money to these adult film stars, which is really he's essentially saying that the president, or I guess the candidate directed him, which could be problematic moving down the road, right, Kerb?
Well, it certainly could, and of course we don't know if he means someone else, but I'm pretty sure he means the candidate. So let's start with the obvious, and that is, was he directed, and was Michael Cohen telling the truth? So you got a couple of ifs all the way down the issue there. So, but if they were, the bigger question is, was this a violation of campaign finance? Now, in just a minute, I want to talk about whether we treat things equally, because sometimes when people have violated campaign finance, it's been a slap on the hand on the Obama administration.
Yep.
Sometimes when people violate campaign finance, Dinesh D'Souza, they actually get a felony for it. And so this is why, and so some people are starting to ask, Nick, even before I get into the basics here, are we treating these things differently? Because back to the point you made just a minute ago, we're, I think, encouraged when we see individuals who are friends of Donald Trump that actually have to go to court and in some cases are going to be convicted, whether it's a congressman from New York, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, whether it is an individual as part of the campaign. I think that's good news. It's bad news in that it happened, but it's good news. It says that nobody's above scrutiny, which we've always had some questions about in Hillary Clinton's circumstance and the Clinton Foundation because of some of the things they've done. So that is part of the issue. But the other part of that is certainly we all knew that this was a New York playboy. And so, again, he wanted to try to take that off of the issues. Of course, one of the lessons to learn is maybe don't consort with these individuals in the first place. Number two, if you do, don't run for office because it's all going to come out.
Yep.
And so that's the case. Now, does that mean it's a violation of campaign finance? Well, if you can make the case that there were other reasons for it other than the campaign, and if indeed the money did not come from campaign funds raised from other individuals, then I think he's probably safe, as much as that means to anybody that looks to the details. Because think about this. The campaign was pretty much funded by a man by the name of Donald Trump. So it's really his money going into the campaign that went over there, if it did. And if it did, certainly Michael Cohen, he's in trouble for all sorts of things besides just that. But the bigger issue, which we talk about as Christians, is just, Donald Trump. He brought enormous amount of sexual baggage and immoral baggage to this campaign and to now the White House, and he's having to deal with the consequences. And some people say, well, maybe he's become a Christian now. Maybe he has, but the bottom line is his past sins are catching up with him, and they're showing up in the press every single day, and that's, again, going to have an impact on the midterm elections.
It will be very interesting to see that. I think one of the things that I was really interested in is because what we saw with Michael Cohen is an individual, because it goes back to that point of, is it that type of contribution? Was it an in-kind contribution? Because at the end of the day, it's very different if Michael Cohen kept the money and then just paid them off than if he donated it to the campaign and then it was funneled through the campaign, touched the campaign. Because it always brings back reminders of what happened in 2008, right, with Jonathan Edwards. And
I was just going to bring up Jonathan Edwards. Yeah, John Edwards, again, that they went to court over that particular issue, and you can talk about it, and he was exonerated in every case.
Yeah, and so if there's a precedent that's been set right now, it appears as though it won't be anything. But I think what will be the interesting thing and what's causing everyone to be able to ask the question is, will this cause a subpoena to come for President Trump, and will he go before whether it's the Mueller investigation, et cetera, et cetera. That will be the interesting question that we have, that will inevitably be answered. Who knows when? I feel like we're living in dog years right now. A week is like a year right now with so much news that happens, or rather non-news that happens. So it'll be interesting, Kirby.
Yeah, I think so. Let me again just say that one of the other questions we talk about so often is anybody above the law, or are we treating laws and crimes in a different sort of way? Because in 2008, the Obama campaign accepted $2 million worth of illegal campaign contributions, but they settled the matter with a fine. Mm-hmm. And so then, of course, we fast forward to Dinesh D'Souza, who just paid a little more than $2,700, which is the campaign limit, and had a felony. And now you have Michael Cohen, who I think has violated a lot of other things, but one of those, again, I'm just not sure I would retain his services. I'll take that advice, but nevertheless, guilty on a felony for campaign misdeeds. So let's treat it fairly. Whether you're rich or poor, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, same laws on campaign finance, seems to me.
Yeah, I think there's the hint of, we want the rule is the rule. I think it's really important, especially from President Trump, the law and order candidate. We want the laws to be enforced fairly, and equally would be two key words. But nevertheless, we've got to go to a break now. I'm just looking at the clock. But when we come back from the break, we'll transition. We'll go to Duncan Hunter, because I feel like
there's more. It's like the ginseng knife commercials. And there's more.
And there's more. Duncan Hunter came down and quite a stinging indictment that came on him. But we'll overview that and what it has to do with you right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson. And Kerby, we've been going through the list of indictments. We're going through the list of, I feel like we're on court TV right now. We're just kind of making our way through. And so we started off with the Paul Manafort being found guilty on 8 counts. We transitioned in the next segment talking about Michael Cohen being pleading guilty on 8 counts. And now we're just going to go to one where I think there's just 2 counts against Representative Duncan Hunter out of California and his wife were indicted on charges of using $250,000 in campaign money for personal expenses and for falsifying campaign finance records. And what many are pointing to is the fact that, one, Duncan Hunter is not going to go quietly with this. He was just stripped of some of his committee membership in the House. But then, two, it's the reminder, especially you being from California would know this, that he's going to stay on the ballot, which is not necessarily the greatest campaign ad to have out, where you are being charged right now with some of these with these charges that are going to come against you. It's not the best campaign advertisement that one could have.
Not exactly. And, of course, we talked a couple of weeks ago, just to complete this circle, that we talked about that one member of Congress in New York who said he was going to stay on the ballot, the one that, of course, was accused of insider trading. It was very obvious. He finally decided to take his name off the ballot, so just in case people weren't aware of that. But Duncan Hunter, who is the son of another Duncan Hunter that we knew as well, I think might have a problem, and I don't know him well, but might have a problem with the idea that maybe once you're the son of a person of privilege, you sort of have this idea of privilege. So that's the first issue. Number 2, I do suggest that Duncan Hunter and his wife Margaret go to Crown Financial right now and begin to reevaluate how they spend money, because I don't know this, but it sure seems like his wife is a spendaholic. And again, this is charges of wire fraud, falsifying records, campaign finance violations, conspiracy, to mention just a few. And you might say, well, what did they spend their money on? Well, I'll give you a short list here. An Italian vacation, dental work, purchases at a surf shop, large tabs at bars and restaurants in San Diego and Washington, D.C., represents the San Diego area, as you might know. And I think the strangest one that I saw on the list was they had paid charges for a flight for their pet rabbit for that. And all of this, they said, were just accidentally charged to the wrong credit card.
It happens to me every time. Whenever that pet rabbit, he's just crazy.
Yes. And again, if you have 2 credit cards, and maybe you have, I don't know if Dallas Baptist University has a credit card, but let's assume they do. You have your own. There's a possibility someday that you could accidentally hand them once, but to do it 13,000 times, I don't know how many times.
I learned very quickly whenever I accidentally charged something to a company card. I learned very quickly not to do that again. To kind of give us some scope and scale on this.
There is some real problems in this marriage and in this campaign, and it's just one more example of where the Republicans could lose a seat and the Democrats could pick up a seat. And believe me, if it's the difference between 22 seats and 23 seats between Nancy Pelosi not being Speaker of the House and Nancy Pelosi or whoever maybe replaces her, Duncan Hunter is really not going to be well loved.
So for scope and scale purposes, let's understand this for a second. So the Hunters spent substantially more than they earned, according to the indictment. They overdrew their bank account more than 1,100 times in a 7-year period. I'll say that again, 1,100 times in a 7-year period, and approximately $37,761 in overdraft and insufficient funds bank fees. There was one report out by the Federalist that indicated that the Hunters, according to the indictment, only had $20 in their account. But yet, apparently, the campaign coffers had a little bit more than that. So I guess it makes sense that they would be doing that. But Kerby, you bring up a really great point, because it does ripple out. Because again, this just understanding the ripple effect that's going to have because of this, especially when we look here in Texas as well, because we've got 2 races in particular. One, the representative seat, the 32nd district with Colin Allred, and then the incumbent Pete Sessions, as well as the Senate seat with Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke. That is much closer than what individuals or anyone were really expecting at this particular time. Ted Cruz is up by one poll has him 7, another poll has it 11. When he won by I think like 16 points this past time. So it's much closer than anyone's expected right now.
Well, and again, since I'm sitting in Chelsea's seat here, I'll play Chelsea for a minute. She says, well, I don't really believe those polls. You know what? True. The only poll that matters happens in November. But at one of those polls only was a 2% difference, and that's really within the margin of error.
Oh, easily.
And a lot of the problems, Nick, for our listeners for just a minute, because I've done commentaries over the years on polls, and a lot of people say, well, they never polled me, and how can they say they're that accurate? They only talked to maybe 1,000 people. Yeah, well, you can very quickly, and since I've had enough courses in statistics to verify the fact that you can actually, within a 95% confidence estimate, actually give you a very predictable kind of poll. The problem is this. Even though statistically the polls may be accurate, although sometimes they're fudged a little bit, the problem is trying to guess who's going to show up to vote. And in a presidential election, that didn't work out so well, Hillary Clinton, in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and others. And in a midterm, it is even more difficult to assume that is the case. Now, right now, you want to talk about momentum? Representative O'Rourke has the momentum in ways that I don't think people still have an understanding of, but simply drive around, since most of our listeners here live in the state of Texas, and count the number of Beto signs you see and the number of Cruz signs you see. And as I've said before, trying to find a Ted Cruz sign is like trying to find a unicorn, because there just haven't been investments in that. And more recently, the county that I live in, they went out and spent their own victory money to actually produce 1,000 signs that had the Ted Cruz logo on it. And you might say they had to produce them. Yeah, Ted Cruz eventually provided them with the logo so that then they could print the signs themselves. Now, there was somebody else that was actually complaining that he'd been trying to get that logo for weeks, and his name is James Dickey. You say, who's he? He's the chairman of the Texas Republican Party who had not yet, from the Cruz campaign, got the logo so that the Texas Republican Party could print their own signs because the Cruz campaign is not producing them. Does that tell you something? Where's the enthusiasm? Because for the Beto signs, let's talk about something else. Ever since the whole issue of McCain-Feingold, we have to treat federal elections different than state. So that means every person, theoretically, that has a Beto sign in their yard had to pay $25 for that. Wow. Now, does that show enthusiasm? Every time you see a sign go 25, oh, there's another 25, there's another 25, add 25, thousands and thousands, that adds up to real money very quick, doesn't it?
I think so. I'm from Tennessee, so I can't be trusted to do too much math. And so I want to, and speaking of math, I want to touch on this, and we'll touch on this once we get back from the break too, Kerby, because we look at, so Ted Cruz in 2012, he ran and he won 4.4 million votes. But, and we talked about the momentum is not on his side right now in the least bit. But there's also something else that's not on his side, which is particularly maybe some, I don't know, voter fraud. Maybe there's some people out there that aren't really people, or I don't want to say they're not really people, but there's individuals that aren't citizens that are here, especially here in Texas, which is a problem.
And we talked about this the other day, and again, there is one estimate that there are about 280,000 individuals that are registered to vote in the state of Texas. That's the entire state of Texas, that are not actual citizens. They are illegal immigrants that have been registered. And so that's the first issue. Well, again, if it's that close, 280,000, now again, I would say a fraction of those 280,000 might actually vote, but you never know. But then they also went back and said, as we see these irregularities right now, they estimate there could be as many as 4 million voter registrations that have an error in them. Now, the error could be simply transposing of a digit, or it could be the wrong age. We talked about recently in that 12th congressional district out of Ohio, you had about 170 people that were listed as over 116 years of age. In case anybody wonders, the oldest person in the world is 115 years of age. So obviously there's a problem there. So those may be very small issues, but Nick, it gets back to the bigger issue. With that much kind of voter irregularity, the chances for mischief are very significant. And we have seen some people saying maybe it's time for the governor to say we need to do something here to clean up the voter rolls.
That would be interesting because, again, we think about 250,000, right, or 280,000. And you think about that, that's around 4 to 6% swing if all of those individuals move. And in a close race, that 4 to 6% is going to be very significant when it moving forward.
It won't affect the governor's race.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it'll affect. Well, it might affect the attorney general's race.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering about that one too, but it certainly could affect the U.S. Senate race.
So
who would have guessed?
What a time to be alive! But we've got to go to break, and when we come back from break, we'll continue Court TV or Court Radio. Now we'll move into a little bit more pressing news, where tragically we found. The investigators found Molly Hibbs' body and more about Hibbs' body. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but we got to go to break. When we come back, more on this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. At the end of July 2018, the Attorney General of the United States hosted a Religious Liberty Summit in the Grand Hall of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. As far as I know, this is the first time in our nation's history that a sitting Attorney General has held a day-long summit on religious liberty. For that, Attorney General Jeff Sessions and President Trump are to be commended for the administration's ongoing commitment to religious liberty. Those like me who attended the summit heard from a cross-section of America's religious community. One Jewish rabbi spoke of years of discrimination by a city in Florida intent on keeping their small synagogue from worshiping in their town. A Sikh told us stories of the bullying and abuse his faith community faces throughout the country. One Muslim attorney reminded us of the very real Islamophobia her community faces on a daily basis. Catholics, Protestants, and others spoke of similar concerns ranging from religious land use to matters of conscience. More than a task force will be required to protect the religious liberty of all Americans in the military, our schools, within houses of worship, and throughout the public square. Yet gone are the days of an administration prosecuting nuns over birth control and reducing the robust protections of the First Amendment to a watered-down freedom to worship. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson. And, you know, Kerby, we've been going through all these lists of indictments and all these lists of wrongdoings when it comes down. We started off the hour talking a little bit about Paul Manafort and him being found guilty on 8 particular counts relative to just some of his indiscretions from a previous life before President Trump, or I guess during the campaign as well. And so then we transitioned and talked a little bit more about Michael Cohen and him pleading guilty to 8 counts. 8 was just the magic number if we were watching Sesame Street yesterday. And so Michael Cohen,
8's the number,
pleading 8 counts, and then Representative Duncan Hunter. And then we talked a little bit about some of his campaign finance stuff. And now we're going to switch gears a little bit to something a little bit more tragic, or definitely a lot more tragic in nature, is that New York Times reports that a body believed to be that of Molly Tibbetts, the Iowa college student, was found yesterday. And so Molly Tibbetts was the 20-year-old that vanished a month ago after going for a jog. And on Tuesday morning, investigators announced that they had found her. A 24-year-old undocumented immigrant has been charged with first-degree murder in the killing. And Kerby, again, this is just another reminder, a little, not even just a nudge, just a sinking in the heart of the reality of knowing there are individuals here in the U.S. right now that we just have no accounting of.
Right.
That it's increasingly important for Congress to be able to do something, to be able to make sure that we know the people that are here in the country right now.
Well, and that is the sad reality, because we have individuals that have crossed the border, and we always talk about the border, but even building a wall, 40% of the people here illegally overstayed their visas. Mm-hmm. And you might remember that even the 9/11 hijackers, those were the individuals that actually overstayed their visas. So it's at every front. It is what happens at our ports. It's what happens at our borders. It's what happens even as people get off of airplanes. And when you start figuring out that for a while we were having what essentially were planes unloading people, and we didn't know where they were, because if you use an illustration saying people cross the border, that doesn't help. But I used to use the illustration. The numbers don't work quite as well. But imagine if you had a plane that landed in Seattle, another plane that landed in Portland, one that in San Francisco, one in San Diego, one in Los Angeles, one in Chicago, one in Dallas, one in Kansas City, one in New York, one in Atlanta. I think that was close to what I mentioned. And everybody on the plane, we didn't know where they came from, and we did not know where they go. And people would go, we'd just be at a panic. Yeah. But that was essentially how many people were coming either into the border, across the border, coming into our ports, or overstaying their visas. And like you said, when you don't know who they are, most of these individuals come for very high-minded reasons. Mm-hmm. They want to support themselves. They want to support their family. They want to pursue the American dream. But it only takes a percentage of those who come either for other reasons. They want to run drugs, they are part of a gang, or they're potential terrorist cells. And so what I think is unfortunate is sometimes some on one side say they're all a bunch of animals. Mm-hmm. That's not helpful.
No.
And there are others on the other side, no, these are hardworking people that we want into our country. Well, neither are perfectly true, because I say that a lot of these individuals probably will make good citizens, but we don't know who they are. They're not on a track to citizenship, and they're in the shadows. And then there are some that really do intend us harm, and I think we need to know who those people are.
Yeah, I think that's where it requires a level of nuance right now that you're just not hearing right now. It's either one, you have to be for building the highest of high walls, or two, you have to be for the eradication of any type of wall whatsoever. And, it's always ironic that the individuals that are shouting the loudest to tear down the walls are the ones that are behind the walls of their homes. But nevertheless, that's a whole nother story. But what we continue to see is that it's important for us just to understand that these are still people, the undocumented immigrants. And we should almost to a certain degree take it as a compliment that they want to come. But it's increasingly important for us to understand who they are. And just because we don't know who they are right now doesn't mean that they're not contributing at all. Like for example, there was a study that was put out that indicated that undocumented immigrants contributed $23 billion last year in tax revenue dollars. So it's not like they're freeloading, but in instances like this, we're reminded of the need for law and order, that because we have a system of law and order, this person, regardless of whether they're documented or not, will receive justice, because the absolutely tragic act that happened, but is another reminder that not only was there justice that demands to be achieved in this particular incident, there's justice that demands to be resolved relative to the immigration situation right now.
And again, the booklet that we sent out to some of our top donors is on immigration. And in the back of the booklet, I recommended a chapter in a book by a friend of yours, Jim Dennison, mm-hmm. and also recommend an article by one of my colleagues, Steve Cable, that talks about how we put some of these biblical principles together. I suspect maybe Brent will have something to say about that. Maybe Jonathan does. Because, again, got to be real careful that we don't just extract from the Old Testament principles that were part of the Old Testament theocracy, but yet the general principle of treating individuals no matter whether they're here as citizens or aliens, with respect, because they're created in God's image, is certainly there. And so it's a difficult set of circumstances. But back to the point you made a minute ago, yes, those people have contributed to our society. And the sad reality is they're probably not governed by OSHA regulations. Mm-hmm. They probably are not governed by any kind of disability. Because if you're living in the shadows, then first of all, your employer, if you have one, can exploit you in ways that they couldn't otherwise. And then you don't have an opportunity to participate because, after all, you're not really looking to go even to register to vote, although we've already pointed out a fair number of them apparently have somehow or another, because you don't want to self-identify you. As a matter of fact, even in Dallas here, we had State Senator Don Huffines with us just recently, and he's identified more than 1,000 individuals. I forget the exact number of individuals, even in Dallas County, who we know are illegally registered. And these are just the ones we know because they self-identify. In other words, they show up for jury duty, and they say, are you a citizen? Well, no. But you're registered to vote. Well, yeah, but and they self-identify. And if you've realized those people self-identify, just think of how many others have not self-identified and how much of a problem we have with that. But again, individuals come here, we want to put them, if they're going to be productive members of society, into some kind of path of citizenship. But obviously they need to also address the issues of being here illegally and all sorts of other issues.
I think you bring up a good point that's not being talked about right now, because when there's the establishment of law and order, the desire for individuals, especially individuals on the right, that are increasingly wanting there to be a system set up in place in order that we might be able to account for the individuals that are here, it's all often like synonymous with being treated cruelly and being an unfair punishment. When it's almost the exact opposite is the case, right? It's one, we want a system of law and order because the system of law and order has been intrinsically linked to economic prosperity, one, but also two, it's compassionate because there's individuals that can prey upon them and that can and leverage them, and they're being taken care of, which is just very unfortunate. So there's a compassionate element to it too that I just don't think is being trumpeted.
Sexual trafficking, that's another aspect that we've talked about as well. And so the solution from one party is abolish ICE, and then that solves the problem.
No, that is, we need ICE. Believe me, I've drank Diet Coke without ice, and it is just, Diet Coke's good regardless, but just so much better with ICE. And let's just look at the good things that ICE has done too. Just even yesterday, they deported the Nazi here. Which
there you go.
Thank goodness that we just don't.
The last remaining, as far as we can tell.
But nevertheless, we are going to have to jump over to break. And so when we come back from break, though, we're going to have a special guest that's going to be with us in studio. We've got Brent McDougal, who is the pastor of Cliff Temple Baptist Church, but also wrote a new book out. And that book is called Faith, Hope, and Politics. It's geared towards millennials specifically, and how to appeal to millennials to engage in the political process. Fascinating book. Very much looking forward to talking with him. And we'll also be taking some of your phone calls. So you're going to want to tune in, but also you can call in as well and ask him some questions. That number is 800-351-1212. But we're going to go to break. But when we back, we'll have Brent McDougal.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome to Point of View on this Wednesday, August 22nd day, also known as Tooth Fairy Day. I am your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson and also Brent McDougal. We've got quite a show for you. For those that have been tuning in since the first hour, you know that we talked a little bit about the Michael Cohen saga, a little bit about, we kind of transitioned, Kerby, over to Court TV.
Yes, we certainly did.
We made our way through the Michael Cohen debacle, the Paul Manafort debacle, the Representative Duncan Hunter debacle, and then touched a little bit on the tragedy with Molly Tibbetts and then the undocumented immigrants. But now we're going to switch gears a little bit because, like I mentioned, we've got in studio, we've got Brent McDougal, who is the pastor over at Cliff Temple Baptist Church here in Dallas, Texas, and he wrote a new book called Faith, Hope, and Politics. And we are so excited that you're here with us today, Brent. How are you?
Thanks so much, Nick. Doing well. Yeah, thanks, Kerby. Great to be here.
So great. So I've got this book, and so if you're online right now or you have access to a computer, you can go to www.pointofview.net, and when you go there, you can see Brent, and you can also, there's a link there that you can go ahead and click on over to be able to purchase this book or to take a closer look at it. And so tell us a little bit about this book, Brent. What, I guess more importantly, let's talk about the author first. What's your background, Brent? What I know, based on conversations that we've had in the past, there's always been that political bent inside of you, but also obviously being a pastor, there's that theological component of it as well. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Nick, I grew up in Alabama.
Okay.
And
Roll Tide, sweet home Alabama.
Come on, you're talking
my
language. We grew up at a time in which, of course, Alabama politics have always been very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people that I've had two great loves over my lifetime, and that's religion and politics. The two things that you're probably not supposed to talk about at any party, but I love mixing them together and putting faith in action, especially in the public square.
Mm-hmm.
So as I was growing up, faith was very strong. My grandfather was a Baptist pastor, 41 years in the same country church. He taught me, and then my dad taught me. Family raised me up in the faith. And then I had a lot of experience and exposure with the Alabama legislature. So some of my mentors were legislators and lobbyists. And I always saw a lot of cohesion and overlap between the values that we talk about on especially Sunday and how we live out during the week. And I've always felt like faith has a very strong application to political life. There's a lot in culture right now that I think is trying to push faith voices to the margins. So I wanted to write this book as a call to action, especially to young people, millennials, and just a push of what we want to see, really, whether you're millennial or whether you are, mid-career, even into senior adults, just a desire to get active. Don't give up. Let your voice be heard, and just put your faith into action, whether it be through policy, speaking out on certain policies, becoming active in supporting candidates that you really value, or even yourself running for political office. Because I firmly believe that God is calling people into the public square. Don't give up, but keep fighting for what we believe in.
Yeah, Kerby, it's really interesting just because what we've been talking about and what we've been observing lately is just there is just a reticence to be able to participate, reticence to be able to engage, almost a level of apathy that's starting to characterize the millennial generation when it comes to engaging the political sphere.
You know, and Brent, one of the things I might just point out is Nick and I share a lot of things in common, and one of those is we both had fathers that have been involved in politics. So that means, you know, we learned at a very young age that you walk precincts and you knock on doors and you get to meet people. But you know as well as I do, there are a lot of people in the church that have just simply said, there is no way I'm going to get involved in politics. It's dirty, it involves compromise, and that's one of the things you try to address in the book, isn't it?
Right. I believe that many people feel powerless or disillusioned. They have given up in a way, just sort of checked out, believing that politics, especially as we look at local government all the way up to the federal government, that it's just kind of tainted to a degree that they just don't want to have anything to do with it. And what a tragedy that is, because so many decisions are made for the collective, and I believe God wants people to lead, and to do so, even if it's a difficult type of situation. You know, sometimes we're called to swim with the sharks and to try to be faithful, even though we sense that it's going to be a difficult road to follow.
I think that's one of the unique things, too. And I don't know if it's just because and I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek right now, I don't know if it's just because the characterization of the snowflake, that we just don't have a backbone, there's no grit. You talk about grit. You mentioned Angela Duckworth in your book. What's fascinating is just that there's always been problems. I mean, there's always been problems within our culture, not just in the American experiment, but especially coming at it from a biblical perspective, right? Think about Joseph, for example. He's the one that was subjected to crazy injustice. But at the end of the day, he rose to a level of power that was number 2 in Pharaoh. I mean, there's just always been that sense of disillusionment. There's always been that sense that there's been, I don't want to say the victim mentality, but I will say there's been injustices that have been had, but really, it's overcoming those, right? What the biblical narrative would say is that don't grow weary of doing good, to recognize that we can mount up like wings, mount up like a winged eagle, one might say. So there's always been that sense that, yes, there's always been wrong, but the key part is individuals that are spurred on by that sense of what is right and then trying to perpetuate that into the future.
That's right. It's often, I think, at that systemic level that we are the most afraid to address, and yet it seems like through the biblical narrative that God was constantly addressing systemic injustice, the morality of leaders, the calling out of bad shepherds, the move toward freedom. It is just ingrained in the people of God, and I think we've lost something of that.
Yeah, it's fascinating just because there's never been a perfect place, right? Like, well, I guess I should say there was a garden once, but we screwed that up pretty quickly. But there was that garden component, but ever since then, there's just been God's grace that is able, I mean, just at the very first instance, God's grace of being able to provide that garment in Genesis 3:21, so that the garment that was given, that was due to the sacrifice of something, the garment was given in order that man and woman might be able to go out into the world and then to try to make sense of it, to try to bring order to it. And that's what I'm really excited to be able to talk more with you about, specifically once we get back from break, is this idea of how do we go and make order in this world in which there are injustices, in which there are hard things to be able to overcome. Like, how do we kind of the new house? How do we politics is kind of the coming up with solutions in close proximity with one another. Like, how do we do those things in a way that brings glory to God, but also does good for our neighbor as well? And then I guess from the millennial perspective too, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts relative to the millennial kind of demographic right now, that generation that's just so large right now, but is so apathetic and really just not only not in going to the polls, but really not even registering for voting right now. And so you touch a little bit on this. And so when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more, or not a little bit more, a lot bit more rather, with Brent McDougal, who is the pastor at Cliff Temple Baptist Church. He's got a new book out, Faith, Hope, and Politics. You can pick up that book or by clicking over on the Point of View website, pointofview.net. You'll see Brent's face. Click on that, and then you'll be able to go towards his book. But we've got to take a break. But when we come back from the break, we'll talk a little bit more about him. But we'll also open up the phone calls for you. So you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, 800-351-1212. Or you can go on Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. Share your question or comment, and we'll share that online as well. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recently, Jay Cost wrote that the Declaration of Independence was more radical than any of the men who signed it. Once you understand that important point, you can give more credit to the document than it currently receives on most college campuses. The standard line is this: Thomas Jefferson wrote that all people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, but he was a slave owner. There's a significant disconnect between his words and his deeds. Jay Cost, author of the new book, The Price of Greatness, argues that the Declaration set in motion the means to remove all governmental privilege. Over time, the Declaration was used to eliminate property restrictions for voting, then abolition, women's suffrage, and voting rights of African Americans. The justification for each of these revolutions was grounded in the philosophy of the Declaration. Now, to be fair to Thomas Jefferson, he actually wrote in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence that the king waged cruel war against human nature itself, against a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. These words were rejected by representatives from the southern colonies. Jefferson also expressed his opinion that slavery was a hideous blot and that it constituted moral depravity. He also led an effort in the Virginia legislature to ban the slave trade. Later, he proposed a program of slave emancipation and even urged federal legislation that would have banned slavery in the territories. None of that is to defend Jefferson, but at least to provide some context that is often missing in both academic and popular discussions of Jefferson and the Declaration. The document may not have banned slavery, but it did provide the foundation for the changes we enjoy today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson, as well as Brent McDougal, who is the author of the new book out called Faith, Hope, and Politics, Inspiring a New Generation to Community-Changing Political Engagement. And so, Brent, we've talked a little bit about the background of the book, background of yourself, where you've come from. Tell us a little bit more. Give us the thrust of the book.
The book's written as a call to action, and also one that is intended to really help with spiritual formation, and something that will, I hope, inspire people to really lean into a value-based sort of engagement with public life. So the structure of the book has to do with the qualities that are all biblical, that I believe are also spirit-driven, such that when these are the foundation of one's life and put into practice, I think they're going to lead to a strong opportunity to lead, but also the endurance to keep going. We start out with chutzpah, just that idea of persistence. We've already talked about the systems that can be pervasive and sometimes overwhelming, and they keep people from ever even stepping into the arena at all. So I believe that God is calling men and women to perseverance, and out of a sense of their character through God's work in their life, they are going to just persist and just keep going. So, you know, and I think we've got to keep asking, where do we get courage? Where do we get chutzpah from? You know, there's all kinds of places that people look for it, but I think there's only one that's really going to endure. And so the book through and through is really centered on the life of faith. It moves through other qualities like tenacity and humility and vulnerability, which I think is really important for the next generation of leaders. Everything culminates with faith, hope, and love. I think those are the three things that are going to define people of faith in the public arena. So walking out their faith with conviction, willing to sometimes pay a price for that conviction. Those that lead with hope, and not a false hope, but a real hope in the future that God is leading us into. And then the love that we've got to be practicing in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things, because he said you've got to pick up the book, and again, the book's at pointofview.net, and so you can click there, and then you can go over to this little website called Amazon and pick that book up. I think this Amazon thing's going to catch on, but nevertheless, you divide the book into 3 sections, and it's you, others, and then politics. And just when I was thinking about it, as I was making my way through the book, I thought it was so interesting, just because I couldn't shake the idea of Jesus in Matthew 7 talking about the individual that has that's judging the speck in someone's eye and then the log in their own. It's that sense of reflection that you call to individuals to in that first part. Not necessarily because we're all broken individuals. We've all got logs in our eyes, but also not only just to understand the brokenness of our own self, but also to understand the capacities that are within ourselves as well, right?
Right. What's happening in your own soul and the way that God is working in your soul. Ultimately, the work that you do and the impact you have is going to be an extension of the degree to which you've allowed God to come in and to really transform you. Introspection is one of those things that I think in the busyness of life somehow just always gets pushed to the side. I believe that introspection, though, is something, if we can develop within our day-to-day practice, time for reflection, and that means reflecting in Scripture, reflecting in prayer, also valuing the friendships of those that speak into our lives, often with God's voice.
Yeah.
Reflecting on our circumstances. Sometimes we move so quickly through the day, we don't even have time to know what it means or what God is saying in the middle of it.
Yeah,
so,
I think that's one of the interesting things, because you talk about the introspection component. There's almost a sense that recognizing that God has knit you a certain way, and recognizing that there are certain skill sets and there's certain capacities and there's certain compassions that individuals have that really do leverage you to be able to be God's hand in that particular part of the community. I mean, I think I don't know if it's more of a Pavlovian kind of thing or what. It's sometimes we're always reminded that Washington's broken. Washington's broken. Not only is that just a preconceived notion that we have, but every campaign ad starts with that now. So I don't know if it's because of the campaign ads or because of what we see, but nevertheless, it's a whole different thing. Understanding the brokenness of Washington can kind of be overwhelming. Where am I supposed to leverage my talents and skill sets? But what you're calling for, really, this introspection component is the Richard Rohr quote that you used. So, like, this is it. Like, this is my passion. This is the thing that God has made me for, that I might be able to engage the Spirit in such a way to bring Him glory and the world good.
I think Washington has been broken and has always been broken to a degree because people are broken. And when do we ever turn and say, you know, this is as much about me and my community as it is about what we see in Washington? We put people in place. We make decisions that ultimately lead to who our leaders are going to be. So I do believe it's so important that we start with ourselves. We look and see, where is my brokenness? Where am I showing up in such a way that perhaps I'm not the leader that God has called me to be? I'm not fit to lead in this regard. And so we've got to, yield in that regard to letting God do that work in us.
Yeah, and so there's the Rusty Buy-in quote that says, to reduce the ugliness in the world, you have to reduce the ugliness in yourself first. And so this idea of, okay, how can I introspectively analyze how God's gifted me and where I need to be able to move up, be better today than yesterday, better tomorrow than today. But then you transition into the next section and you talk about others. Spell that out a little bit more.
Others has to do with that communal component and the way that we work with other people. We maximize our relationships. We don't try to do it alone.
Yeah.
There's that myth of the sort of the great hero, the one that's going to accomplish everything that we're always going to look to. We get disappointed again and again. Some of the greatest things that happen in our communities are the product of people coming together and doing so in such a way, because of what people see happening with those smaller units of society, it gives people courage.
Yeah.
And they think, if these people can get along, we can get along. We can do something, and we're not alone ever.
Yeah, it reminds me of the African proverb, like if you want to go quickly, go by yourself, but if you want to go far, you go with others, right?
Right.
And just
I think that's in the book.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
good.
And so like the idea of wanting to make sure that we're all coming together and we're all a part of this. But Kerby, as you know, I mean, you can give firsthand experience. I'm sure when you started off in the political sphere, especially because you're a precinct chair now, I'm sure that there was a lot more people in the beginning than what there is now. The community engagement really has just decreased significantly over the years.
It really has. And again, like we said, we need other individuals to be bringing about some kind of success. And I've had people on this program say that anything that I did that was of significance happened with a group of individuals around us. So that's one issue. But Brent, let's also talk about the other side of that, and it's accountability. People in political office say, well, I'm accountable to the voters. Well, that's a joke, because you're accountable at best every 2 years, every 4 years, or a senator every 6 years, and really even then you're not accountable. We just had a controversy here about a member of Congress that didn't seem to be spending his funds correctly. And it seems to me that a Christian that is involved in the political sphere needs accountability, and that's the church, and that's other people that can speak into his or her life. They've said that one of the successes of Billy Graham is that Grady Wilson knew Billy Graham before he was Billy Graham, if you know what I mean, and could speak into his life. We really, in order to avoid scandals, need people to speak into our lives, don't we?
That's right. I believe that oftentimes you will hear political leaders who have the language of faith, but there's a certain way of talking that I think if you listen long enough, you'll realize that they really don't have much in terms of spiritual accountability. And really, it's just co-opting biblical language or people's spiritual values as a way to kind of garner support. So I'm so impressed when I hear about a leader, whether it's in Congress or on the local level, that has a group of people around them that they meet with on a regular basis to encourage, to correct, to give input, and just to really kind of hold up. We all need people like that, and I want to encourage people too, those that are listening today, don't neglect praying for your leaders and finding ways to encourage them, because I do believe that it can be isolating and people can find themselves sort of apart. But we need to hold leaders accountable to be in community, to be connected, and believing that the power of prayer over people can really make a difference, even if we feel like sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, that's so good, so good. And we're going to have to take a break, but when we come back from break, we're going to continue talking with Brent McDougal and his new book, Faith, Hope, and Politics, Inspiring a New Generation to Community-Changing Political Engagement. You can find that book on our website, pointofview.net. Click over on See More on the front page, and then there should be a link that's available for you to be able to purchase this book. I would highly recommend it. But when we come back, we'll continue talking with him more. Specifically, we're going to move into that last section of politics. But then before we do that, though, I really am anxious to be able to hear more about the neon suit illustration. And so maybe that'll be a teaser for individuals. The neon suit, you'll hear about a little bit more. But we'll also be opening up the phone lines to you, 800-351-1212. You can call in at 800-351-1212. Leave your question or comment, and we'll air that as well. Or we'll just open up the phone line so that you can talk to Brent, but also on Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. What you share online, we'll try to share over air as well. But when we come back, more with Brent McDougal on faith, hope, and politics. We'll be back right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson, as well as Brent McDougal, who's the pastor at Cliff Temple Baptist Church here in Dallas, Texas. Also the author of the most recent book he's got out is Faith, Hope, and Politics, Inspiring a New Generation, Community-Changing, political engagement. We've been talking with Brent for a little bit just about his latest book, and this idea. I've just been captivated by the idea. It's divided up into 3 sections, obviously. You've got the really the emphasis upon the you, understanding your brokenness, understanding your skill sets, passions, the level of introspection to be able to allow how you have been gifted. There's the others component that we were talking about. So help us when we're moving into this politics component. Help us to understand what are you trying to communicate during this in this particular section, Brent?
The structure of the book has to do with what I believe is the right flow, so that you're considering your own soul, you're thinking about your own spiritual walk, you're connecting with others in such a way that has integrity and that maximizes impact, and then you're moving toward community change that can happen. So often I think we get those things reversed. We step out in ego, we step out in things that we want to see and that we want to change. We get burnout, and then we start looking for other people to help us.
Yeah.
Whereas I believe that the pathway of Jesus was demonstrating to us that flow of connecting with God first, then with others, and then expanding out that movement. So there's the structure to the book that sort of reflects that idea. And then when it comes to the idea of politics, I think it's, how do we help people to think about what does faith look like in the public square? What is the value of love relative to the way that we interact together? And how can we inspire more hope that is true hope, and not a false or just temporary kind of hope?
I think one of the interesting things that you bring up is this idea of like civility to a certain degree, like the idea of wanting to work with people that might have disagreement with you. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I have my Christian friends, like we disagree on a wide variety of issues, but yet we're still able to come together. And it's kind of hard, especially for an outside world, especially if everyone's being inspired by the same book, which again, that's subject to interpretation. If everybody's being inspired by the same book, how do they hold various opinions and argue so vociferously about some of those opinions? So speak to us a little bit about how you talk about civility, respecting one another, loving one another in the midst of your disagreements in the book.
Right. We've lost the capacity for civility. And I believe
I completely disagree. No, I'm just kidding.
That totally tracks with, I think, honestly, the decline in religion. Churches have been really, I believe, important centers of places of disagreement for years. We do have a common ground in which we walk, but there's also a sense that people come together and that we can disagree on a lot of stuff and still affirm one another as brothers and sisters. So, to me, this is something that's one of those big heart issues. I feel heartbroken when I see the amount of divisiveness that happens in the public sphere and that discourages so many people. When people see the politics of divisiveness, when they see the way that there just seems to be no opportunity for finding middle ground and of working together, that, as much as anything, makes people think that's just not going to be a good place for me to invest my time. Who wants to be involved with that? I posted something on Facebook a couple days ago about the Oak Cliff, just the awful news about a priest who had abused 3 persons 10 years ago, and then reflecting on the news in Pennsylvania and just reflected on that. And very quickly, 2 people began to chime in on Facebook, and then they got into an argument themselves within the little post. I wasn't responding at all, but I was watching it, and again, my heart was kind of broken for how quickly it can happen.
So you're saying kind of the lack of civility, just this vitriol that individuals have. You think it's because of the lack of church, because of the lack of a foundation? I guess you would say just the lack of a biblical understanding of how we interact with one another, even when we have disagreements?
I believe it does come down to love.
Okay.
I think if we love the way that Jesus loved, he was willing to meet people where they were. He was willing to show them care, even if they did not agree with him. He was willing to let people walk away from him because he did love them, and he was not willing to sort of just push on them his views. So if we're going to walk out the life as Jesus did, then that's what we're going to be called to do as well.
I always think it's so interesting, especially just in this time with Facebook. And so maybe you can't yell at somebody, but whenever somebody puts all caps lock, I always just get very alarmed by what they're saying right now. And it always reminds me of this idea of what Desmond Tutu said, right? Like, don't raise your voice and prove your argument. And it seems like we've kind of lost that, right? Because
That's right.
we're just yelling at one another. And I wonder and I know there's the cliche thing of we're not talking with one another anymore, but it's not even so much we're not talking with one another. We're talking through one another. I seem to, and I love your feedback on this. It's because I'm talking to you, and I might disagree with you about peanut butter. Okay, we'll use that as an example. And a shocking twist, our listeners can be like, he's talking about peanut butter again. Again. And so, Brent, we'll say that you lack character issues, you have character issues, and you like chunky peanut butter. For some strange reason, we don't know why you like chunky peanut butter. But I'm not just going to talk to you and tell you about the glories of smooth peanut butter. I'm going to talk through you, because at the end of the day, I'm just using you to try to excite my base of smooth peanut butter people so that I could have this taped, and then we can put a label on it saying where Nick owns the libs, or Nick destroys the chunky peanut butter guy, right? So it's not, we're not even it's not just talking with one another anymore. It's we're talking through one another, and I'm just dehumanizing you in order to generate some clicks on the internet. That's what it seems like we're in right now.
That's right. The internet does not reward nuance. Mm-mm. It does not reward those that are willing to find some middle ground and to speak a word of peace in the middle of conflict. So I do believe that a very important quality for Christians moving forward is to learn to listen more and speak less. Listen first and seek to understand, and then as we have opportunity to share the truth that God has placed on our heart.
Okay, so I'm gonna be the devil's advocate here, because I completely agree with what you're saying, but I can hear a listener right now that's telling me right now that seems like a weak position that's holding right now.
Sure.
So how do you respond to that?
Sure. I would respond to that by saying, if that is a weak position, then it seems like Jesus demonstrated a lot of weakness when he walked the earth.
Yeah.
He was willing to listen. He was willing to ask questions and let people respond rather than just sort of putting a truth out there immediately, because he cared about people. He wanted people to come to understanding themselves. I don't believe it's weakness to listen. In fact, I believe it's strength, because it demonstrates that we feel confident enough in the truth that we have, that we can stay at the table, we can keep in dialogue with people, we can show respect, even if we disagree, and believe that God is at work and helping us to ultimately convey the truth that we have.
Yeah, that's really good. And so we're going to continue to have Brent on, but we're also going to open up the phone calls for questions as well. So you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number's 800-351-1212, or facebook.com/pointofviewradio.
And one of the things about civility is working with our community. And if you've been around Nick or me for any length of time, we talk about Edmund Burke and the little platoons. And it does seem to me that some of the solutions aren't so much political as they are spiritual. So what I think we need to do is try to find a way to communicate to our secular society that really, if you want to solve problems like poverty, racism, and others, there's only a limited amount of what government can do, what laws and can do, but there is a need for the church to get involved. So how do we speak to a secular culture that says, we really don't need you religious people, we really don't need the church, we can solve all the problems on our own?
I think it's a great point. I think that there have been many who have thought, well, if we just get the policies right, if we just allow government to do this for us. But the truth is, there are lots of policies that are already in place, still some that are unjust that need addressing, and yet with all the progress in terms of policy, still our communities are divided and often segregated by race. We see schools in the same sort of dynamic, and so I think we'd have to say there's something deeper going on here that is more than a government solution could ever account for.
Well, again, I think just looking at the numbers, how much money have we spent on education and how we are not doing very well? How much money are we spending on incarceration of individuals and not having prison reform? How much money are we spending in terms of welfare, more than the national debt? And we still have people that are poor. So obviously there's something else that money can't solve.
I think we've got to keep calling the church to be the church, to care for people, to take responsibility for our communities, to be willing to be places where we can talk about the hard issues and to make tough decisions sometimes that are going to sacrifice our comfort, but we can't expect anybody else to do this. I mean, this is why God has called the church, and to be that community that was a city on a hill. I was just reading that in the Sermon on the Mount, the expectation that Christ has for his people and what he wants us to do together, to be the salt of the earth, the seasoning.
Yeah, it's like everybody's running around with a hammer and all they see is nails. And so what they're doing is, when in reality, they're just breaking stuff, because it's not stuff that can be fixed by government policies, but rather it's the church called to be the church in some of those places. And so when we come back, and we're going to talk a little bit more, we're going to jump ahead into contemporary and how we can apply some of this when we get right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. At the end of July 2018, the Attorney General of the United States hosted a Religious Liberty Summit in the Grand Hall of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. As far as I know, this is the first time in our nation's history that a sitting Attorney General has held a day-long summit on religious liberty. For that, Attorney General Jeff Sessions and President Trump are to be commended for the administration's ongoing commitment to religious liberty. Those like me who attended the summit heard from a cross-section of America's religious community. One Jewish rabbi spoke of years of discrimination by a city in Florida intent on keeping their small synagogue from worshiping in their town. A Sikh told us stories of the bullying and abuse his faith community faces throughout the country. One Muslim attorney reminded us of the very real Islamophobia her community faces on a daily basis. Catholics, Protestants, and others spoke of similar concerns ranging from religious land use to matters of conscience. More than a task force will be required to protect the religious liberty of all Americans in the military, our schools, within houses of worship, and throughout the public square. Yet gone are the days of an administration prosecuting nuns over birth control and reducing the robust protections of the First Amendment to a watered-down freedom to worship. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined in studio by Kerby Anderson, as well as the author of Faith, Hope, and Politics, Brent McDougal. And Brent, okay, so we're going to talk about this neon suit. I know I teased everybody in the beginning about this neon suit, but I just need you to know some context for this. So when I was in college, I played on a intramural team called the Professionals. And so as the Professionals, we were the C team, which means we weren't the best in our fraternity. We weren't the second best in our fraternity. We were the absolute worst. And so we played individuals that were also the absolute worst. Needless to say, we thought we were professionals, though, so we decided to go to Goodwill. And when we went to Goodwill, we bought suits, and we would play soccer in these suits. And so nevertheless, when I read that you had a illustration on the neon suits, my mind was going back to the Professionals. But nevertheless, that's a totally tangential point. That was the rabbit that I just chased around the studio for about 10 seconds. So tell us a little bit about this illustration with the neon suit. I thought it was so good.
The illustration has to do with a church member, a guy that I loved for many years. He ended up moving away, but he showed up one Sunday, Nick, and he had this bright neon yellow suit, and he would sit on the front row. So I'm trying to preach, and I'm trying to make eye contact with everybody, and all that I can really see is this flashing neon suit that is going off in my periphery vision.
Love it.
And then I would see this guy invariably after worship service, and he would be talking to me, and I'm trying to keep eye contact with him, but all I can see is the suit that he's wearing.
Wow.
So over time, I just kind of got over it because he wore it all the time. And that became for me a sort of a metaphor for the way that we're called to love people. Because I believe that many people, and I think all of us to some degree, have sort of something on the outside that we sort of present to other people. And that can be sometimes the most off-putting thing. And some people just never engage in relationship because they see that's all that they see when they see this person. And so they never get past that thing in order to really talk to people and get to know them and hear their story, have an opportunity. So I've often shared with the congregation, we have a lot of people, we're in urban Dallas. We have lots of people that come through our congregational doors, and I just encourage people, hey, look past that neon suit. You know, figure out how do you love someone and really meet them. I'm going to make it my mission, Nick, to get you a neon suit. All right?
Yeah, I like that mission. Hopefully it's not Mission Impossible. Shout out Tom Cruise. But nevertheless, it reminds me of the quote, what is it, Pliny the Younger? It's been kind of attributed to a lot of people. It's the idea of be kind, for everyone you know is fighting a hard battle. The reality is everybody has on this bright suit. The mass of men live lives of quiet desperation, right? And to be kind to individuals. I want to end this, though, and we've got about 6 minutes left, and I think this will be really, it won't be enough time, but I'm really interested you in the book on imagination and just this need, especially with millennials that are disenchanted, I guess you could say, apathetic, and the need for imagination. Tell us a little bit more about that.
God is a God of dreams, a God of helping us to envision the future that is different from what it is now. I love it in Jeremiah when it says, call to me, I will tell you things you don't even know, things that you did not imagine. And it says in the New Testament that God is able to do immeasurably, exceedingly, abundantly more than we could ask or imagine. That is the kind of faith and imagination that I believe God wants us to pursue. So we see things as they are right now, and we can get really discouraged, and we can think maybe there's not a whole lot of hope there. But if you look at the New Testament, we know how it ends. We know where everything is heading. We know God's dream for the world. And so in that vision, we are able to imagine what the next step might be. We don't have to see the fullness of it. We may never get there ourselves, just like Martin Luther King said. Martin Luther King said, I'm not going to get there myself. I may never see it, but he could see beyond his present circumstances. And I believe that is what God is calling us to do with our current political climate. We have got to imagine a different way. I believe that millennials can help us to get there.
Yeah, I'm convinced by that. And I remember the first show that I did. Well, I don't know. It was one of my first shows when my dad called in. I don't know if you remember this.
I do remember
my
that.
dad called in, and my dad pointed the question. He didn't tell me the question. And the first thing that came to my mind is he said, how do you get millennials involved politically? And what's that thing that would do it? And I remember saying, it's the JFK, right? It's the big vision that we want to go to the moon. It's the Ronald Reagan, tear down this wall. We're going to defeat communism. Those big visions that we just lacked right now. I don't know. It might be Space Force now. Who knows? No, I'm just kidding. But it's like that big vision to recognize that we're not where we need to be. We're much further along than where we have been. But how do we utilize the imagination? And especially from a Christian perspective, even Jesus mentions it in his prayer. It's the idea that your kingdom would come, your will will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We know the ideal, and we're intimately acquainted with the insufficiencies that we're living in right now. How do we utilize our imagination in order to be better today than yesterday, better tomorrow than today? And I think that's through leaders that can cast a big vision, and that big vision can be so compelling that we recognize that we can't do it alone, but we've got to come together, bring our unique talents and skill sets in order to make it happen. It seems like that's the case.
Right. I see a neglect of the great biblical vision, the great dream that God has. If you look at Isaiah, if you look at Jeremiah, if you look at the early church, the way that they walked out life together, you get a picture of the life that God has designed for us, and and I believe the future that God is drawing us into, if we're willing to have that faith and hope and love, and to believe that God can use people like us, just everyday people, to do amazing things.
Yeah, the only problem about having to deal with those type of things is realizing that you can't be the center of it all, right? I think that the selfishness component, and I think that's pretty clearly the narcissist epidemic that Gene Twenge has wrote on, and Chris Leish has talked about. But then at the end of the day, you don't get the selfless component to it, but you have to give that up in order that you might be able to be a part of something bigger, which I think can just have ripple effects and can just can abound in God's goodness and also His glory going forth from it, and the world being blessed by it. But it does require to give a little bit of yourself, or as Jesus would say, deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow Him. But okay, so we're in the last little segment here, and so tell us a little bit more about the book. Where can they pick up the book, et cetera, et cetera? Where can they find out more information about you?
You can get the book on Amazon. You can also locate it on the Smith & Helwis website.
Okay.
You can get it in print form or in Kindle edition.
Okay.
And I'm hopeful to just keep starting conversations, finding ways to engage people around these really important issues. I'd love to hear from people. If you go on my website at the church, clifftemple.org, you can find my email address, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at Brent McDougal.
Okay.
And I just love to hear how the words are impacting people in a variety of walks of life.
Well, Brent, thank you so much for joining us. This has been I'll go ahead. I can highly recommend it. It's a phenomenal book that it's able to tie together and really does help you to better understand, one, the capacities and skill set that you might have, two, interacting with others, and then three, politics is what Father John Newhouse would say. It's this idea of recognizing the impossible problems that are in front of us, but also coming up with approximate solutions to some of those problems. And so that's the very heart of democracy. But nevertheless, we're going to have to take one of those breaks right now. But when we come back from the break, we'll have a new author. It's Book Wednesday, Kerby. It was the number 8.
We don't do that to you too often, but today we are.
You're making me read all this stuff.
Yeah, but you love to read, just like I do.
The number 8 was the number of the day yesterday with the 8 counts, and I'm not talking about chicken nuggets. And so now we'll transition over, and we'll have Jonathan Merritt that will be joining us by phone right now. He's got a new book out called Learning to Speak God from Scratch, and so we'll be talking with him in a little bit, and you can find out more information on his book at our website at pointofview.net. Again, pointofview.net, or you can jump on over to Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. We'll have some of that information available on the Facebook site, but then we'll also be talking to him right after the break. You can call in if you'd like to ask Jonathan a question. I know he's given quite a bit of these interviews thus far. Back right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View for the third hour. I am your host, Nick Pitts. On this August 22nd, 2018 day, I am joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson. Kerby, we're moving into hour 3, man.
And we are going to have a chance to talk to Jonathan again. We had him in studio. Now we get him by phone.
Now we've got him by phone. And so for those listeners out there that have been with us for all 3 hours, don't mind this. We'll just recap a little bit. During the first hour, we talked a little bit about, we kind of functioned like court TV, kind of went through all the court cases relative to Paul Manafort and him being indicted on 8 counts, getting charged 8 guilty counts. And then we talked about a little bit about Michael Cohen and him pleading to 8 guilty counts on criminal charges. We talked a little bit more about Representative Duncan Hunter, which indicated some of his kind of spending habits that he and his wife had, I guess, to say the very least.
Yes.
And then in the previous hour, we talked with Brent McDougal, who is the author of the new book, Faith, Hope, and Politics, a little bit more about the millennial engagement in the political square and how one might be able to be spurred by the imagination to be able to enter the political square to work for the common good. And now we have got over the phone, we've got Jonathan Merritt, who's up in New York right now. He's the Atlantic contributor for the Atlantic, and has a new book out called Learning to Speak God from Scratch. Jonathan, how are you today?
Hey, thanks so much for having me on, guys. It's good to be back with you.
Oh, so good to have you back. So good to have you back. And so you've got this latest book out that came out almost, I guess, about a week ago, if I'm correct. And so tell us a little bit more about this book. What spurred you? I guess I'm more interested in what spurred you to write this book.
You know, a few years ago, I moved from the Bible Belt to New York City. And when I was living in outside of Atlanta, I was a teaching pastor at a large church there. All of my friends were friends who thought like me, talked like me, went to church with me. And when I arrived in New York City, I experienced a little bit of a culture shock, which I expected. But what I didn't expect was I ran into this language barrier and could no longer, what I call in the book, speak God. I really struggled to have spiritual conversations with people. Either they didn't understand what I was saying, or they would ask me what I meant, and I suddenly realized I didn't understand what I was saying, or the words that I would use felt negative or alienating, created tension. And so over time I realized I wasn't having spiritual conversations at all. And it wasn't until later I realized I was actually like a lot of Americans, the majority of which are not having spiritual or religious conversations on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, again, at the beginning of the book, one of the interesting things you do is you identify and then you talk about how you commissioned a study with the Barna Group to really try to figure out, are Americans really speaking utilizing religious language, I guess would be the words that I would use. And what you found is some striking results according to the Barna study.
Yeah, so I found, I expected, look, yes, America is 70.8% Christian. That's how they identify. But I mean, most of us who are involved in these conversations know that number's a bit high when you get right down to it. There are people who say, I was baptized when I was 3 years old in the Catholic Church, and they checked the Christian box, and they couldn't tell you where the nearest church is or, you know, what they really believe. So that number is higher than probably it should be. But I thought, you know, maybe 30-40% of people in America speak God, have a spiritual conversation, a religious conversation on a regular basis. Nowhere close. Only 7% of Americans say that they talk about these things regularly, and the number is not that much improved for practicing Christians. Practicing Christians, people who go to church regularly, who claim to be Christian but are also really faithful, only 1 in 8. So if you go to your average church, whether you're in Texas, Atlanta, New Jersey, and only the most faithful people are there, you look around you, 7 out of 8 of those people will not have a spiritual or religious conversation even one time in the next week.
That's fascinating. What do you attribute to that? Like, why are people not having these type of conversations? It seems as though if they're willing to give up that time to be able to go on Sunday, to be able to make the commitment and various other sacrifices when it comes to kind of following after the Jesus way, one might say, you would expect them to talk a little bit about it more. I mean, I eat peanut butter pretty much once a week, and I can't wait to tell people about peanut butter. I mean, we naturally share what we love, right? And so what do you think's keeping people from having some of these conversations?
Well, you've actually just touched on something there that is so simple and so critical, which is, as human beings, we naturally speak about the things we care about. You know, if you care about your kids, you talk about your kids. You'd probably find it pretty weird if you had a friend for 5 or 10 years and you hung out with that person, you had lunch with that person, and one day you come to find out they have a spouse and 3 children and you didn't even know it. You would really think something was off there, because we talk about the things that we care about, whether it's the Yankees or our family.
I never would talk about the Yankees.
Yeah.
I never would talk about the Yankees.
But so many of us claim to be interested in, passionate about our spiritual lives, and yet something in that process is breaking down. What I decided to do with this study was to take all the people who spoke God infrequently, people who said, yeah, I don't really talk about religious or spiritual matters. And I said, why not? Tell us why not. And we got a whole bunch of different answers that we kind of broke down into a number of categories. One is kind of this big box that I call avoidance. So people will say, you know, these things create tension or arguments. 51% of Christians right now say, if I think that the person I'm speaking to will reject me, then I will avoid a religious conversation. I won't even bring it up. There are people who say, I don't want to be thought of as an extremist. You know, that's a big answer now given among millennials, because in this country, the majority of Americans now say trying to convert someone, trying to evangelize someone makes you an extremist. But then there's also a level of ignorance. And I know that's sort of a pejorative word. That's not how I mean it. But I just mean both among Christians and non-Christians, people just don't know what these words mean anymore. You know, they use words over and over and over, but it's kind of like the word color or the word thee. You've used it so often, but you can't really stop and define it. And when you can't define a word, you will end up not using a word. And so we found that there are a number of kind of cultural pressures and internal pressures, depending on where a person lives and what their spiritual background or religious background is. Regardless, the majority of Americans say, when it comes to religious conversations, when it comes to God talk, I'm out.
That's fascinating. So we've got to take one of those breaks. And when we come back from the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about Jonathan and his new book called Learning to Speak God from Scratch. You can find out more information on his book, as well as the Amazon link to be able to get to that book at our website, pointofview.net. Again, that website's pointofview.net. But when we come back, we'll continue talking with Jonathan about his latest book. And just, it's really fascinating. Not only we'll break down some more of the statistics that he worked with the Barna Group to be able to discover. And I'm going to be really interested to talk about kind of later on in the book about how his process that he goes by, that he's kind of outlined in the book, about how one might be able to rediscover some of this moral language, rediscover some of these rich biblical words, and how we might be able to speak God into the various sectors and spheres that we've got. But we'll also open up the phone calls to you, so you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. Or you can jump on Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. And so if you are on Facebook, you can leave a question or comment right underneath the live video box. And what you share online, we'll try to share over air as well. But when we come back, more talking with Jonathan Merritt and his latest book, Learning to Speak God from Scratch, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recently, Jay Cost wrote that the Declaration of Independence was more radical than any of the men who signed it. Once you understand that important point, you can give more credit to the document than it currently receives on most college campuses. The standard line is this: Thomas Jefferson wrote that all people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, but he was a slave owner. There's a significant disconnect between his words and his deeds. Jay Cost, author of the new book, The Price of Greatness, argues that the Declaration set in motion the means to remove all governmental privilege. Over time, the Declaration was used to eliminate property restrictions for voting, then abolition, women's suffrage, and voting rights of African Americans. The justification for each of these revolutions was grounded in the philosophy of the Declaration. Now, to be fair to Thomas Jefferson, he actually wrote in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence that the king waged cruel war against human nature itself, against a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. These words were rejected by representatives from the southern colonies. Jefferson also expressed his opinion that slavery was a hideous blot and that it constituted moral depravity. He also led an effort in the Virginia legislature to ban the slave trade. Later, he proposed a program of slave emancipation and even urged federal legislation that would have banned slavery in the territories. None of that is to defend Jefferson, but at least to provide some context that is often missing in both academic and popular discussions of Jefferson and the Declaration. The document may not have banned slavery, but it did provide the foundation for the changes we enjoy today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, and welcome back on Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined in studio by Kerby Anderson and over the phone by Jonathan Merritt, who just recently wrote his latest book, being Learning to Speak God from Scratch. And we've been talking with Jonathan a little bit about some of the research that he highlights in the beginning of his work. He commissioned to work with the Barna Group to be able to indicate and try to gauge, in particular, how individuals and how Americans are speaking God, the moral language that they're using. And Jonathan, one of the interesting things that I found, and one of the things that I highlighted in the book, is this idea that only more than 1/5 of respondents admitted they've not had a spiritual conversation at all in the last year, which is just fat. It's one thing to not talk about it for a week. I can kind of understand the idea of not talking about the God that you love for a week. I can understand that, but for a whole year, that seems astounding to me.
Yeah, it is astounding. It's astounding in particular because you can have a spiritual conversation or a religious conversation even if you're not spiritual or religious. Yeah. So a non-believer can have that kind of conversation. When you dig down into that, you find that of that 20+%, only about 4% of those people say that the reason that they haven't had this conversation is because they're not religious, which means that 16% of that 20% have another motivation behind it. There's something cultural that's happening that makes them feel uncomfortable with these kinds of conversations. And I think that what we're seeing as a result of these social pressures, and I'm not overstating the case to say this, is a widespread death of sacred speech, sacred words, spiritual conversations. And I think that if these current trends persist, it's not overstating it to say that spiritual conversations will be an endangered species within my lifetime.
That's absolutely fascinating. But here, we'll go back. I'll push against that, though. And so, because I think that some of your other research, though, is indicative that seems as though it's just very telling, because you speak in the book, and especially through some of the research, some of the younger people are the ones that are using spiritual language more than even older generations, right? So maybe, is that potentially going to be a resurgence, or are we just seeing it's just a minor little outlier blip on the map?
Well, it's tough. That's sort of tough to say. What we do know is that spiritual conversations are still very, very rare among every generational demographic.
Oh, yeah.
They are less rare among millennials. Now, what we find is that what happens to a lot of folks, and I bet there are a lot of folks listening to this, maybe you're a baby boomer, or maybe you're even older than that, you sort of feel like the world that you've known, the world you knew growing up, has changed so rapidly, and you don't know the rules anymore. What can I say? What can't I say? What words are okay to use and which ones are off limits? What offends people and what doesn't? Whenever there's that kind of confusion around the sort of the rules of engagement, right, conversational etiquette, you tend to withdraw. What may be happening is that many millennials out there feel comfortable because they know the rules. They're sort of fresh to the scene. And what will happen is as their world changes, they will also see that kind of generational decline over time once they begin to feel that the world that they have known is now fading away.
That's fascinating. So we're speaking with Jonathan Merritt right now. He's got his latest book out called Learning to Speak God from Scratch. You can order that on Amazon, or we've got a link also on our website, pointofview.net. And Jonathan, one of the interesting things is we're going to continue to open the phone line, so you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. And you've been talking about how individuals are not speaking God. They're not using in their conversation, they're not inserting God into the conversation, as some people are so apt to put it. But I think that one of the interesting things that you found in some of your research is you said their most common reasons for not engaging in these type of conversations kind of fall into three broad categories: indifference, ignorance, and avoidance. So kind of elaborate for our audience on those three.
Yeah. So you have a lot of people who say in the ignorance categories we talked about a little bit before the break is they just say, I don't really understand these terms. And for some people, it's because you're not religious. You haven't been to church. These things sound foreign to you. They sound strange. You also have other individuals who they've been in the church and they've used these words so often they become shop worn. If you go into a room today, you go into a church even, where people tend to think the same. You try this out. Go to your small group. Give everybody an index card and tell them to write down the definition of the word gospel. You will get almost as many answers as there are people in the room. And when you begin to converse and use these words and you realize, well, I don't really know what this means, and I don't know if my definition is the same as yours or it's different, your confidence in the language of faith decreases. And so that's oftentimes what I call, ignorance, not in a negative sense. It's just the unknowing of what these words mean. The other category is avoidance, and that is driven by a number of things, oftentimes by political correctness, where people think, you know what, I just shouldn't talk about religion. It's not proper. It's not appropriate. The old trope about polite conversations. You don't talk about religion and politics. Many people have said, I see these words as a source of pain because I had a pastor or a parent who used these words in an abusive way, and for whatever reason, they avoid them now because they feel toxic. So you get a lot of people who just straight up avoid them, and then there's a small proportion of people that I would say are indifferent, and those are the folks who just say, yeah, these things don't matter to me. I don't care. There is a small proportion of Americans who just think spirituality is a bunch of bunk. I'm least concerned about people who avoid those conversations because they're just absolutely indifferent to spiritual matters at all.
That's fascinating. And so as I'm hearing you talk right now, it seems as though there's like two categories, and a lot of it seems like it's in their head, right? So it's the idea of perception, right? Like I perceive that the culture will be antagonistic towards me, or I perceive that I don't know enough, hence the reason why I'm not speaking it. Would you largely attribute this to be more of an education problem or a cultural issue right now? Is it just that people think that they're going to be viewed as the enemy of the state if they were to speak God into the public square? Or is it more just an education problem where it really is just the fault of the church for not educating individuals to go out and to be able to speak the truth in love in season and out of season?
You know, the answer is yes. It's actually all of those things. In some cases, we don't really understand what these words mean because there are a whole bunch of other trends happening, right? Church membership has declined. So one of the things we know from linguistics is the less often we gather as a speaking community, the less we will end up speaking that language because it becomes less comfortable. When I was a kid, you know, we had Tuesday night visitation, we had Wednesday night prayer meeting, we had Sunday morning and Sunday evening church plus youth choir, right? So, I was at church a lot. So I was using these words a lot. These days, fewer of us are going to church at all. And those who are, you might get an hour or two out of them a week if you're lucky. So we're not gathering in places where we're working this out. What is the answer? Is it to go to church more? I don't know that that's going to work. I don't know if that's the way to do it. I do think we have to begin creating communities in the places where we live, work, and play, where we are speaking God regularly. If you're a mother or you're a father listening to this, to begin having these conversations around your kitchen table or your coffee table. If you're part of the PTA, to invite your friends into these kinds of spiritual conversation groups to talk about God with them, to be bold enough and courageous enough around a water cooler or over lunch with coworkers that you could begin to have these conversations. I don't think that the answer is just to say, let's get as many people as possible into the church, but rather to empower those in the church to carry this language, to carry these conversations, to increase their confidence to speak God once more in the places where they already exist.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things. Like, I think that key word that you use to be able to hone in on words is the idea of empowering. I think the insecurity would be crippling individuals from having some of these conversations, hence the reason why they're avoiding them or they're just trying not to be a part of them. And it's just the perception of what others are thinking about them. And it makes me think back to what David Foster Wallace wrote in Infinite Jest. He says, you'll be way less concerned with what other people think of you when you realize how seldom they do. Yeah. It's like we're so outside of our mind and trying to perceive what others are thinking of us that we realize that they're probably thinking of themselves to a much greater degree. So maybe that should free us up to be able to have some of these conversations about the things that should matter most to us. But nevertheless, we're going to have to take a break. But when we come back from the break, we'll continue talking with Jonathan Merritt about his latest book, Learning to Speak God from Scratch. We've really just been analyzing the situation right now with some of the research that he conducted with the Barna Group. But when we come back, he's got a great little guide, I guess you could say, to help individuals better understand some of these spiritual words and how we might be able to contextualize them in our situation today. We'll come back, but we'll also be opening up the phone lines. So you call in at 800-351-1212. And we'll be back right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151. and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts, on this August 22nd, 2018 day, also known as Tooth Fairy Day. So happy Tooth Fairy Day to all our listeners, as well as Kerby, joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson, as well as Jonathan Merritt, who joins us over the phone, talking about his latest book, Learning to Speak God from Scratch. We've been talking to Jonathan, kind of unpacking just kind of some of the troubling numbers that he discovered through his research with Barna, that's indicating that Americans in general are largely not speaking God anymore. They're not using the moral vocabulary, largely out of avoidance, out of other issues as well. And so, Jonathan, help us understand, like you outline in your book a little bit, ways that we might be able to move forward. Kind of elaborate on that for us.
Yeah, it can be a little bit depressing, honestly, if you're a follower of Jesus and you value these words, you value these virtues, you think these are things we should be talking about. When you see the numbers, it can really leave you sort of depressed. But then, as I was doing research for this book, it took me about 4.5 years. I spent a year studying linguistics. And I kept running across this phrase. The phrase was comeback language, a comeback language. What is that? What is that? And I realized that there are a number of languages that die out every year. They just vanish. But there are also a select few that come back. They go to the brink of destruction and they return to us. A great example of this would be Hebrew. I'm sure some of your listeners probably know this, that with the rise of the modern Israeli nation state, Hebrew came back. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, Yiddish is now spoken on the south side in the Hasidic quarter, and that was something that almost died out thanks to the Holocaust, sort of an Eastern European Jewish dialect, but it's coming back, and there are lots of examples of these. So what do you have to do to bring a language back? Well, one, it requires a renewed commitment among those who speak the language to say, I realize there are some difficulties here. I realize it's going to be hard to have these conversations. I realize some of it may be triggering, or I'm going to have to wrestle through it. I'm going to struggle. Some people may get offended, but I know that it's worth it anyway to keep speaking God. So there has to be a renewed commitment, and that has to be top down and bottom up, right? We said before about parents and community leaders and just regular folks have to do it, but also pastors. Pastors have to do this. The second thing is that people have to have a commitment to allow the language to take on new life, to be applied in new ways, to be re-understood with the current culture in mind. Every language that has become a comeback language has come back in a slightly different form than it was dying in. A great example we go back to is Hebrew. I mean, when I went to seminary, I know you went to seminary, when we went and studied Hebrew, I can't go to Israel today and speak Hebrew. Well, first of all, I can speak it at all. It's very difficult. But I can't read it. I can't speak it because it's not quite the same language. It's shifted a little bit. With this modern culture in view, certain things have kind of come to new life. And we see this a lot. C.S. Lewis talks about this in a book he wrote on language, Studies in Words, where he says, you've got to have this tree trunk, but it has to sprout new branches over time. A lot of these words, we need to blow the dust off of these things and think about them in fresh ways that help to equip us for the 21st century culture that we live in.
That's fascinating. So help us outline some of this stuff. Like I'm looking right now, when I was reading through, you kind of mentioned everyone from Walter Brueggemann to even kind of a particular favorite of mine, N.T. Wright. You talk about some of these suitcase words that we have. The idea that we've been carrying around these suitcases for so long that we forget about what sometimes is inside of them. And it requires us sometimes to unpack the suitcase in order that we might be able to see the components of this particular word and then repack it again. And kind of in your book, you outline orientation, disorientation, reorientation, packing, unpacking, repacking, order, disorder, reorder. And then you've come up with your own way for us to be able to look at some of these ancient words that we've been given, these sacred words, and to be able to utilize those. And maybe it's time for us to kind of unpack that. So help us unpack that for us.
Yeah, I was hanging out a while ago with one of my smartest friends. That's always a good thing, hang out with your smart friends. And he said to me, have you ever looked at N.T. Wright? N.T. Wright has this concept. And so I look it up, and sure enough, I'm like, this is what I've been studying. N.T. Wright talks about words as suitcases. They're carriers of information. This is true. The word sin, nobody's offended by the word sin. They're not offended by S being next to the letter I, being next to the letter N. They're offended by the idea of sin, the idea that's connected to it. And what he says is these suitcases are the words, the language, and inside it is all the meaning that we've put inside that suitcase. And over time, it's been changed, and we have to learn to unpack these things, ask really critical questions about ways we may have understood it, wrongly, ways we may have misused it to harm others or to not present God as the person that we know God is, and then to repack it so that we have a fresh language that has been wrestled with and thought through and used in real time. This is how you keep language alive. This is how you sort of keep it fresh, or as I say in this is how you revive sacred speech.
That's good. And so we're talking with Jonathan Merritt right now, author of the latest book, Learning to Speak God from Scratch. You can call in at 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. So, Jonathan, let's take this word sin, for instance. So I guess we're living in a world in which there's helicopter parenting, that you can do whatever you want. There are safe spaces, trigger warnings, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, a part of that is that individuals aren't saying the word sin anymore. So how would we walk us through your process, help us to understand how we might take the word sin and unpack it, then repack it in such a way that it might be able to convey the original meaning in such a way that hopefully lends to a conversation which we can speak about the love of our life, I guess, if we wanted to say it that way.
Well, I think what I try to do in here is first you kind of go back to the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so I look at the way the Bible talks about sin. The Bible talks about sin primarily in kind of three ways. The earliest biblical concept is sort of lawlessness. You break the rules. Mm-hmm. The second one is kind of this communal, the weight, that there's a weight placed on the community. That's like, temple Judaism with the scapegoating and all of this. Jesus comes along and Paul, and they talk about sin as a debt. The wages of sin is death, or even the opposite. Jesus sort of goes on, store up for yourself treasures in heaven. And this kind of took on even new ways of talking about sin throughout Christian history. You go into a church today, you might hear somebody talk about you have a sin problem. That problem solution language is very popular today. Or somebody might say you have a sin sickness, which is clinical language. You don't really get much of that in the New Testament or the Old Testament, but you definitely get that today. So you have all of these notions of sin floating around. And then the question is some of these things are jarring, some of them are negative, some of them have unintended consequences. A great example is if the only way you talk about sin is sickness, who's responsible? I mean, if I get a cold, no one's responsible. It just happened to me. And so there's a downside to only talking about sin or predominantly talking about sin as sickness. And so what I tried to do in this book was begin to dream a little bit about what it would look like to talk about sin in a way that kind of encapsulated some of these things, because they're not wrong. They're telling the truth, just not the whole truth, so help me God. They're pointing to something about sin, but they're not the whole of sin. So what I say in here is I talk about the flourishing life, the abundant life that Jesus promised, right? The way that things should be, that we kind of get a view in the Bible of the way things should be. Anything that causes the world to not be the way it should be, we call that sin. And that's, I think, a really easy way to talk about anything that prevents human flourishing, anything that robs us of the abundant life, anything that keeps us from creating the world God intends. That is, and most people know that exists. Now, they may use a different word for it, but if you ask your friend, if they're not even a believer, if you say, do you think this world is exactly the way it should be? You'd be hard-pressed to find someone to say, yeah, I think this world's perfect. It's absolutely the most perfect world that I can imagine. They'll probably say, no, I mean, there's sickness and death and war. People do all kinds of awful things to each other. It's probably not as it should be. Then you're able to say, as a Christian, I have a word for that, and that word is sin. What do you think about that? And bring them into a conversation. I think that most people will find that if they use this word with the culture in view, they'll find that they can actually use it far more easily with less pushback than they think they'll get.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we're living in a world, regardless of whether it's a Christian world or a non-Christian world, we're living in a world in which individuals are channeling the famous Few Good Men scene where we just can't handle the truth, right? And so you've got a Christian world just reading some of the critiques that have been leveled against you that are saying that you're walking back sin. you've got a non-Christian world that's saying, well, it's the reality that we don't think that we're wrong. We don't think that we're broken. We don't think that we have a problem. But the reality is that both of those are just shouting at one another, and no one's willing to have a conversation with each other about the nuance of it and understanding that when you're using God language, it's a lot of different concepts that you're using. It's God language into human words. And so, but we're going to continue the conversation, but we've got to take a break. And so we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. At the end of July 2018, the Attorney General of the United States hosted a Religious Liberty Summit in the Grand Hall of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. As far as I know, this is the first time in our nation's history that a sitting Attorney General has held a day-long summit on religious liberty. For that, Attorney General Jeff Sessions and President Trump are to be commended for the administration's ongoing commitment to religious liberty. Those like me who attended the summit heard from a cross-section of America's religious community. One Jewish rabbi spoke of years of discrimination by a city in Florida intent on keeping their small synagogue from worshiping in their town. A Sikh told us stories of the bullying and abuse his faith community faces throughout the country. One Muslim attorney reminded us of the very real Islamophobia her community faces on a daily basis. Catholics, Protestants, and others spoke of similar concerns ranging from religious land use to matters of conscience. More than a task force will be required to protect the religious liberty of all Americans in the military, our schools, within houses of worship, and throughout the public square. Yet gone are the days of an administration prosecuting nuns over birth control and reducing the robust protections of the First Amendment to a watered-down freedom to worship. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson, as well as over the phone with Jonathan Merritt, whose latest book, Learning to Speak God from Scratch. We've been talking with Jonathan about this book and more, and just really a fascinating book that's come out just about the idea of largely Americans just aren't speaking religious language anymore, or as Jonathan would put it, aren't speaking God, and how we might be able to, one, understand the problem, and two, move towards a solution. And Jonathan's got a phenomenal book out called Learning to Speak God from Scratch. You can find this book more on the Point of View website at pointofview.net or over on the Facebook page, facebook.com/pointofview radio. But we're also going to be taking some phone calls right now. So we've got Lorelda right now. Lorelda, are you there?
Yes, I'm still holding. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, Lorelda. What is your point of view?
Okay, well, it's such an interesting thought, considering what happened for me at school the other day, but sometimes I think it's a fine line between can't and won't, and I say that respectfully because I was called on the carpet, and the first word they used for me was conflict, and I said, could you give me a little example? she said, well, remember when we did see you at the poll? And I said, yes, we should do it more than once. And she said, one of the teachers asked what you were praying for, and you said godly teachers. And I said, yes, ma'am. And may I finish? I also paid for godly administration, safety of the students. I said, that's a short list. And she said, well, and she wouldn't even look at me. So I knew I struck a nerve. And I'm thinking, but you've heard that before, and it's true. And I'm thinking, if it's in the public school that way, it carries over into so many other areas in our public lives. And it shouldn't. We should be able to stand up for our Jesus. Or like the billboard I saw coming up from the valley said, if you have to curse, use your own name.
That's funny.
And I thought, well, yes. And God willing, and if we stand up for Jesus, because I mentioned that once too, I'll say it again. I told them we should change our national anthem to stand up for Jesus. And they said, oh. And they just kind of turned the other way.
Wow. Well, Laurel.
But the Lord knows what I'm trying to say. This nation needs to come back to the one who made us great.
Yes, ma'am. Well, Laurelda, thank you so much for your phone call. So, Jonathan, she kind of accentuates a point that I think many individuals are experiencing right now, which it just feels as though sometimes the culture is a little more antagonistic towards them when they come to speak God, utilize some of that religious language. But there's also a part, so I want to kind of pose this question just based off Laurelda's kind of comments that she was sharing, is, some of the critiques that are coming out against this book right now are arguing that you're trying to redefine words. And but then there's another side that's kind of saying, well, you're not trying to redefine words. Maybe you're just trying to contextualize these words that are more appropriate. So channeling the whole idea of 1 Corinthians 9, to the weak you become weak, to the strong, to the Jew you become a Jew, to the Gentile a Gentile, in order to win some. So what do you say to the critiques that you're trying to redefine words, and then the other side that's just saying that you're just trying to come up with a better way to contextualize some of these words in order to be more effective, to be a brighter witness, I guess you would say, into the Christian culture, or into the larger culture, rather?
Well, first I'll say, Laurelda, thank you for your call, because actually, as I say in the book, public schools are really a microcosm of what's happening nationwide in terms of pressure. So thank you so much for that call and that story. Nick, you asked a great question here. I don't use the word redefine in the book, so I've never actually said that or indicated that necessarily. What I have said is to reimagine the ways in which we use these and how we understand what they mean for us. So that does get, I think, for a lot of people, it makes them squirm a little bit. And yet, I give a lot of examples in the book of how we've come to bring new life, to breathe new life into these words over time. Again, I really try to draw from folks like C.S. Lewis on this, like Walter Brueggemann and N.T. Wright on this, to say, every language changes or it dies. There's not an exception to that. Every language either moves toward evolution or extinction. And so what does that mean? That does not mean that red can become blue. If something can mean anything, then something means nothing. So again, going back to that Lewis analogy, there's kind of like that trunk, which is the central understanding of that word, right? Even the way that I talk about sin is not that sin used to be what was wrong in the world and now it's not what's wrong in the world. It's rather that sin is always kind of referred to what's wrong in the world, and we have all these branches, the branches of sin as problem, the branches of sin as sickness, the branch of sin as debt. And all of those things are getting at what sin is about. So to analyze that, to think about that, to say, what would it look like to think about how we use this term in a way that is helpful, that is life-giving, that presents God as a good and loving God that we know, that presents humans to be what we know humans are, which are fallen and imperfect people. I can't think of anything that is more Christian than that, but it does require that we take words seriously. And a lot of people just don't want to do the work. They don't want to sit around and have these conversations. They don't want to figure it out. They've got their index cards with all of the definitions on them, and they say, I don't want to talk about these. I have figured out what everything means. And folks like that, I think, will be somewhat off-put by the invitation that I'm offering in this book to get back around the table with the Word of God in one hand, or as Karl Barth would say, with the Word of God in one hand and the newspaper in the other, and begin to learn to speak God from scratch.
Yeah, it seems like you're accentuating like a divide. And so I'm reminded of Michael Lindsay. He wrote a book called Faith in the Halls of Power. He differentiates between two different types of Christians. He says there's populist Christians and there's cosmopolitan Christians. And so the cosmopolitan Christians, I would probably assume there's more cosmopolitan Christians than populist Christians in New York, whereas they're much more inclined to be able to go to an art gallery opening, to appreciate the beauty that's on display in a piece of art that reminds them and sends forth the ripples of the idea that we have a God that shines forth in perfect beauty, according to Psalm 50, the same God that David wanted to sit and gaze at for all the days of his life. But then that's not going to necessarily appeal to a populist Christian, because a populist Christian would probably be more located in the South, according to Lindsay, somebody that just really appreciates the Gaither Band and likes going to those revivals and Sunday night and Wednesday night prayer meeting and Sunday night church service, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems as though you're trying to position yourself as almost like a middleman to a certain degree. And what would you say to that?
Yeah, I do think, it's one of the reasons why I moved to New York, because I find that when it comes to culture, you have two opposite approaches that Christians will take. One is Chicken Little. The sky is falling. It's all horrible. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. We're being persecuted like never before, even worse than the Roman Empire. Everything's changing, and God has sort of been dethroned. I think there are problems in the world, and I think many of those problems are affecting Christians uniquely. I don't think that's something you can deny.
Yeah.
But I do still believe that God is in control and that the church will survive. Not even the gates of hell can prevail against it. The other approach is the ostrich approach, where you just sort of stick your head in the sand and you insulate into your Christian communities and you say, well, we'll just sort of wait it out. We'll just sort of let the world change around us, and we'll just kind of keep to ourselves. And we'll go to Christian schools and Christian colleges and listen to Christian music and read Christian books and wear Christian T-shirts and watch Christian movies, and we'll never actually engage with the world around us. And I think both of those are incredibly ineffectual. What I hope to do is, by coming to a place like New York City and writing from this place, where I sort of have that newspaper and book perspective, that people will begin to have a healthier third way and can engage the culture as Christ would have us.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. And if you're interested in getting Jonathan's book, go to the Point of View website. And that's all the time we have. Thank you so much. We'll see you back tomorrow.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God. But what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just